Okay, ladies and gentlemen, before we begin our closing session, we're going to hear from the 6 moderators that have sat and written recommendations that will be on the agenda of the International Task Force working groups over the next 2 days. And each one's going to be very short and brief in the recommendations. First of all, Dr. Thomas Lutz, who moderated a discussion on training staff at Holocaust-related sites and museums. Yeah, right here.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. Can you hear me? It's fine, okay. So, yes, I've just come out of a very intensive and very vivid discussion, and first of all, I have to thank Yad Vashem and the 7th International Conference that you have brought together so many people with an international background, and I think it's very worth to study and to learn from each other, and that's the way to the first challenge which we have for the future. I think the first meeting is easy, but how we can continue with this, that's the question, because it's important to continue this this discussion, and we have reached an in-depth level, and we should continue with this, but then to bring together the people in a way that they really can improve this is not so easy. Also, I would like to thank Noah McCaton, who was my co-chair, and Sarah, who had typed down our very general recommendations. You can read it in the minutes, but I would like to express them with my own words. First of all, we figured out that the situation of the memorial museums in this international level is so different that it's not so easy to make very concrete suggestion. What we only can do is to have general suggestions. Nevertheless, we figured out that the memorial museums, also if they are in Germany or in Israel or elsewhere in Argentina or so, they have so much common aims, so much common things, methods, that it's worth also to continue. Also, as a difference is there. I think you can learn also from difference from each other. The first thing is what we figured out, that is that also the people who work in Memorial Museum as educators have to be trained. Maybe in such institutions like Yad Vashem or like the Holocaust Memorial Museum, you have your own departments and you can make your training among your own. But if you go to a smaller memorial museum, which sometimes are also run by civil action groups, it's really necessary to help them to improve their work. And what we figured out is that we can find help on the one side from people who have the historical knowledge, and on the other side from people who have the methodological knowledge. But to bring these both things together, I think that's very important, and we have to think about how we can do this better. The next thing is, as I pointed out, and we have heard it from, for example, for Theresienstadt, also the large memorial museums which were state-run needs more support because they were overrun by visitors. For example, 2 examples from Germany, in Buchenwald and in Sachsenhausen, more than 50% of the visitors groups who asked for a guided tour cannot get a guided tour because the museums do not have enough money to pay for this. That means, on the one hand, all of these state-run museums need to be better supported by the states, but nevertheless, the starting, and I can say it also with my German background, in trying to deal with the Nazi past and with the Nazi crimes is a civil society. That means you have to do both. You have to either support the huge institutions, but also to find ways how the smaller institutions and how single persons in specific sites who try to maintain them and, of course, at first to develop them also have to be supported. They have to do this both. And what's also important is that these maybe institutions who support these people should be independent from party and from daily politics. They should be based on science and, of course, of the needs of the civil society, but not on governments. That's also, I think, quite important to understand, because if you deal with this question, and maybe in Germany it's obvious, but also if you go to other countries, you have also not only to deal with the question of victims, but also with the question of collaboration, and it's a critical point for society, and governments quite often won't hear it so loud. What we figured also out is that in many different nations, the demands to the memorial museums from people from outside, politicians, teachers, are very high, may I say too high. And what the memorial museums can offer them is, on the one hand, compared to the situation 20 years ago, much better, but it's much more basic. It's, first of all, it's the basic fundament is a historical knowledge. And that means that what we have to do is to bring together and to have an open debate. What can the memorial museums do, and what are the limits of them? And not everything must be burdened on the memorial museums. Also the society, also the university, also the school system, also the informal learning system has their task to do something, and we should see this together. I think that's next thing which is very important. And what we also figured out is that we have also, compared with the situation some decades ago, we have a much larger variety of visitors. First of all, we have much more international visitors, but also the visitors who come from one nation have a much larger variety. We have migration, we have in Germany, we have East and West Germany and so on. And that means that it's necessary to prepare the visits of the groups much better as we can do it in the moment. In particular, that means that we have to know much better in advance which people come to us, what's the background of them, what they would like to know from us, what are their questions, and we can we can offer them much better education. That's a question of people who can make a phone call to them, and if we have, as a topography of terror, 1,500 groups a year, you don't have enough people who make these phone calls to know exactly what the people are doing. On the other hand, so we have a change also in the teachers. So many teachers, at least I think not only in Germany, in many countries in Western Europe are old, and in 10 years we will have a new generation of teachers. And so also on a general level, on the universities, on a teacher training seminars and colleges also, we have to go deeper. We have to work closer with memorial museums and with them together. I think that's in very general and very shortly said the summarizing of a discussion which lasted 1.25 of an hour, and hopefully we will have a possibility to continue it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas. I'm going to ask Dorit Novak, who moderated the discussion on educating about the Holocaust and human rights and other crimes against humanity.
As you can see, I'm not Monsieur Zimere, but I will try to cover for him. The recommendation of our working group are 4. I will just read them very shortly and quickly, and hopefully we'll be able to continue the discussion regarding this issue in the future. So the first one is that the Holocaust should not only be taught as a chapter of history, but must also be taught in the context of students' life. It follows that when teaching about the Holocaust and other crimes against humanity, we must underline the differences as well as the similarities. The other recommendation is the targeting educational system, and it is that educational system must set a clear rationale and goals for Holocaust education and define the relevancy of Holocaust education to human rights. The third one is that the ITF should aggregate existing resources in member countries and other countries regarding Holocaust education and human rights programs, resources, research, and practices, and principally evaluate the integration of these two fields. This has to be learned by the task force in order to be able to come into conclusions and very concrete recommendation. And the last one is that the ITF should reinstate a dedicated committee on exploration of Holocaust and human rights education. Thank you.
Thank you, Dewey. Mark Weitzman, moderate the discussion on diminishing and denial of the Holocaust.
Thank you, Ephraim. The group that Dr. David Silberklang and I moderated dealt with diminishing and denying the Holocaust. The participants of the group all contributed greatly, both in terms of their knowledge and experience and in keeping to the idea of a moderated discussion and in keeping to the time limits as well. Also, I thank Cheryl Hayon for taking down the notes and making them legible for us. By far the biggest concern amongst the group was the question of the commemoration of the Day of Totalitarianism, which was proposed by the European Parliament as August 23rd. The group is absolutely opposed to that and would recommend to the European Parliament alternate dates, such as, for example, the date of the Hungarian Revolution in 1956. This would emphasize the solidarity and interest that the group has and that the community has in participating in these Day of Commemoration to the crimes of communism, as well as pointing out the fact that, among the fact that Jews were certainly a large proportion of victims as well of the communists. We strongly express our concern about the political equalization of National Socialism with totalitarianism. We also prefer the use of the concept communism instead of totalitarianism, and have suggested as well educational programs and meeting with members of the European Parliament to educate them about the consequences of the date of August 23rd and about the possibility of alternate dates. Second is the question of Holocaust denial and diminishment. Hardcore denial was viewed as being so discredited that it is no longer considered a major threat. However, Holocaust diminishment, and by that it includes all sorts of terms as a generic term, including all sorts of issues such as Holocaust relativization, obfuscation, trivialization of the Holocaust, or inversion of the Holocaust, needs to be combated, and the key was felt to that is education. The path to solution to deal with those who are confused about the Holocaust is education and dialogue. However, there should be no dialogue with those who deny the Holocaust or who use diminishment and all its related terms as a political tool or tactic of denial. Teaching about the righteous among the nations is important, but the focus must be on the fact that the righteous were only one part of the story of the Holocaust and not the main part. And finally, any commemoration of the Holocaust must be inclusive of the Jews and all other victim groups, while highlighting the fact that the Jews were the main target of the Nazis in the final solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Dr. Stephen Smith moderated the discussion on commemorating Holocaust Memorial Days in a meaningful fashion.
Thank you. At the risk of sounding like news in brief from the Times, we had a wide-ranging and lively discussion in which we covered a range of differing opinions. That meant that nobody really agreed on anything, and there was absolutely no consensus on coming to recommendations. There were 20 of us in the room discussing 15 different countries, and each individual had something completely different to contribute to the discussion. And what we discovered, I think, in that was that we surfaced a very important node of discussion for this conference and indeed for the wider Holocaust education and remembrance community. Because these issues are really fraught at both an international and national and local level. And there were contributions from everybody in the group as to how we should handle those issues. First of all, what was very clear was a real respect of the initiative of the United Nations to create the International Holocaust Remembrance Day and the importance of that as a signal to the international community. And I think everybody would agree that was in our group that was an important initiative. What was also very clear from the group was that these issues are very pertinent at a national level, and that a top-down approach to Holocaust commemoration is going to be fraught with difficulty, and that there needs to be a real focus on how, at a national level, countries think about their commemorations and create their own content in a meaningful way for the population concerned. The dilemma that we were discussing was, how do you bring together an international community at one level, and at the same time be able to support people at a local level without those two things being in conflict? So we had a few recommendations that kind of came out of that. They came out as questions rather than as answers, but particularly thinking about the International Task Force's role, the group had a few thoughts. First of all, was the recommendation that all member states of the task force and all those who represent governments think very carefully about how to represent the Holocaust in a meaningful way to deal with the national context while being faithful to the international mission. Second thing we suggested was that, particularly the policymakers who attend the International Task Force could encourage the task force to have that conversation that we had here this afternoon every time the task force meets, possibly to create an ongoing working group beyond the subcommittee that exists, but to ask the member states to contribute to that properly and fully, because it is an important area which is clearly not being addressed properly at the moment. We wanted to recommend that some kind of internet platform is created that allows best practice on Holocaust Memorial Days to be shared, but also as a network point for those who are involved in Holocaust Memorial Days, be they policymakers or local volunteers and event planners, so that ideas can be shared across a wide range of people. And finally, to encourage governments to finance Holocaust Memorial Day events, because it's extremely important for those who are trying to deliver them that they have the resources to do so. It's easy for us to say this sitting in a conference in Jerusalem with all of our ideas and our ideals, but actually there is a very pragmatic part to this. If it isn't funded, it won't happen. And for policymakers who these recommendations are for, it needs to be funded. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Stephen Feinberg moderated the discussion on anti-Semitism and Holocaust education.
I would like to start by thanking Rob Rosette of Yad Vashem for helping me moderate this, my co-moderator. Without Rob's organizational skills, it would have been more hectic than it was. As the diplomats would say, we had a frank and open discussion, which is a nice way of saying we came up with no specific recommendations, but a great many opinions were expressed. And I'd like to summarize 5 of the more openly discussed issues. There was general agreement that it is absolutely, positively essential to include the teaching of anti-Semitism, not only in all courses dealing with the Holocaust, but in all exhibits that deal with the Holocaust. But we did not necessarily agree on how this was to be done. Another point was that there was a general feeling that it is often difficult to separate the various forms of anti-Semitism in one's teaching. Religious anti-Semitism, political anti-Semitism, racial anti-Semitism, and then issues of current anti-Semitism, the various aspects of current anti-Semitism. We felt that it was crucially important to differentiate between manifestations of anti-Semitism and legitimate criticisms of the actions of a sovereign state, in this case, the policies of the Israeli government. That it was essential to educate educators to differentiate between them. The issues of materials came up, that it would be beneficial for educators to obviously have access to materials that would give them background information about Israel and about the Arab-Israeli conflict. And that the materials and the methods that are developed need to be appropriate for the local educational context, both geographical region and age of students. And that's it in brief.
Thank you, Stephen. Dr. Rita Abramsky moderated the discussion on recommendations to ministers of education.
First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Anatoly Podolsky, who was my co-moderator, and he left because he had to catch the plane. So, and I would like to thank Martin, who professionally summarized all the recommendations. In our group, just in contrast to the previous groups, we subdivided into 4 groups, and in each there was anonymous agreement on everything. So they actually, even I provoked each group several times. and it didn't help. The provocation didn't work. They were sticking to their opinions as a group, and it was very convenient for the sake of the ITF at least. So we had several groups each group dealing with a separate question. One group, their subgroup, dealt with Memorial Day. So their recommendations are two. It is important to recognize both the 27th of January as Holocaust Memorial Day and the 23rd of August as a memorial to the victims of totalitarianism. And this is one recommendation. Second recommendation, Holocaust Memorial Day should be recognized in a local way with specific reference to events as they occurred in a specific place. For example, in Ukraine, the date of Babi Yar, in Lithuania, the date of liquidation of Vilnius ghetto, and so on. The second subgroup was anti-Semitism and modern anti-Semitism, how to deal with it, how to teach it. So there were several recommendations. Educators should acknowledge that the subject of anti-Semitism is not a specifically Jewish subject, but a universal topic for all. Second, the teaching of stereotyping and preconceived ideas should be started in a very early age at school. And three, teacher training should be carried out in a way that include both traditional and modern anti-Semitism, including Arab-Israeli conflict. The third subgroup was dealing with the real text and context. To what extent can we discuss the Holocaust and human rights? And there was only one recommendation: a real text and context, the Holocaust and human rights should be taught in an interdisciplinary fashion, for example, history, ethics, art, literature, and so on. And textbooks and educational tools should be built as they has begun in Argentina right now. And the last subgroup dealt with the issue, how can we better prepare teachers to visit Holocaust memorials and sites, both authentic and museums. And there are three recommendations. One, there is recognition that ministries will not make these tours compulsory. It should be rather a recommendation. And second, the preparation and follow-up for students is just as important as the site visit themselves. And three, the group also felt government should support NGOs who are preparing the curricula. This recommendation holds for both authentic sites and Holocaust Museum. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all of our 6 moderators who, together with our colleagues, will be preparing a summary of these recommendations to be disseminated tomorrow morning at the meetings of the International Task Force. The summary will also be available on our website as well.